No moon nor sleep today.
Welcome back to The Shadows. The parchment was dry, translucent, and smelled faintly of scorched earth and dry cedar, pulled from an iron-bound cassette hidden deep beneath the creaking floorboards of an abandoned apartment in the labyrinthine heart of Old Cairo. For years, Youssef spent his quiet, unremarkable evenings navigating the congested, shadow-draped streets of El Gamaliya, working as an assistant archivist in a dusty municipal basement where freezing water pipes leaked continuously onto forgotten land deeds and decaying municipal records. He was 26 years old, thoroughly practical, and fiercely cynical regarding the superstitious whispers that echoed endlessly through the dimly lit tea houses of his neighborhood. To Youssef, the unseen world of ghosts and ancient curses was merely a comforting lie invented by the weak-minded to explain the harsh, cold randomness of human misfortune. His daily life revolved entirely around clear mathematical figures, documented timestamps, and the methodical cataloging of physical reality, right up until the damp autumn afternoon when an unidentified wooden crate arrived unexpectedly at his workstation, completely misplaced during a chaotic city redevelopment inventory. Inside the splintered wooden crate, nestled securely between thick sheets of heavy canvas, lay a massive leather volume completely devoid of any gilded lettering, title, or publisher marks. The heavy cover was bound in aged, cracked hide, discolored by ancient watermarks and stained with deep burgundy spots that had long since dried into the porous grain. When Youssef turned the heavy brass clasp, the thick pages opened with a stiff, brittle creak, revealing intricate geometric diagrams, complex astrological charts, and dense lines of archaic Arabic calligraphy executed meticulously in faded crimson and dark charcoal ink. It was an unredacted manuscript copy of Shams al-Ma'arif, the notorious grimoire revered and deeply feared across the Levant for centuries. Youssef smiled slightly with cold detachment at the unexpected discovery, viewing the mysterious book merely as a valuable historical curiosity, an exotic artifact that might yield a handsome sum if sold secretly to an elite private collector in Alexandria. That evening, within the suffocating quiet of his cramped third-floor apartment, Youssef carefully cleared his small wooden dining table and laid the heavy manuscript open directly beneath the pale, flickering yellow glow of a single hanging light bulb. Outside his window, the distant, muted hum of night traffic slowly faded into total background silence, replaced by the persistent, eerie scraping of cold wind against the thin glass panels. As he turned the brittle pages, reading the phonetically complex incantations aloud in a quiet, steady monotone, he treated the ancient text as nothing more than an intriguing linguistic exercise. He followed the prescribed instructions written on page 72 purely out of morbid curiosity, drawing a simple, precise seal of silver powder upon a worn copper coin he kept in his coat pocket, then carefully reciting 3 rhythmic, guttural lines designed specifically to locate small, forgotten valuables. Nothing happened immediately in the silence of his room, and with a soft sigh of mild disappointment, Youssef snapped the heavy volume shut and retired to sleep. The following morning, however, the mundane fabric of Youssef's carefully ordered reality began to unravel rapidly at the seams. While walking toward the crowded metro station through a narrow, fog-shrouded market street, his foot caught the jagged edge of an upturned cobblestone, sending him stumbling forward onto a discarded pile of rotting wooden crates. As he knelt down on the cold stones to regain his balance, his trembling fingers brushed against the sharp edge of a rusted tin box, deeply buried beneath a thick layer of wet soil and decomposing vegetable leaves. Opening the rusted tin with difficulty, Youssef gasped sharply as he pulled out a pristine velvet pouch containing 6 heavy silver coins dating back to the Ottoman era. perfectly preserved and easily worth tens of thousands of Egyptian pounds. A sudden, ice-cold chill crept up his spine, not from the biting autumn air, but from the terrifying realization that the copper coin tucked inside his heavy coat pocket was currently radiating an intense, unnatural warmth directly against his chest. The sudden, undeniable discovery of the Ottoman silver coins transformed Yusef's deep-seated skepticism into an obsessive, burning fascination that rapidly consumed every waking hour of his everyday existence. He locked his apartment door securely each evening, drew the heavy fabric curtains tightly across the glass, and sat before the unholy grimoire with a small leather notebook, meticulously documenting his relentless attempts to decodify the complex geometric arrays and precise planetary alignments outlined within the yellowed, brittle pages. The ancient book almost seemed to respond directly to his physical presence, its stiff pages opening effortlessly to specific, obscure chapters whenever he sat down beneath the weak bulb. The uncanny benefits began modestly, almost innocently at first. A spoken cadence that caused a sudden, unexplained burst of good fortune in his mundane daily errands. A simple protective diagram drawn on scraps of parchment that turned away an aggressive street dog in El Gamaliya, and a quiet, rhythmic ritual that cleared his agonizing chronic migraines within mere seconds. To Yusef, the ancient manuscript was no longer a worthless piece of local superstition. It was an exact, long-forgotten science that unlocked the dark, hidden levers of reality itself. Yet, as the humid autumn days progressed steadily into late November, the underlying atmosphere of Yusef's cramped living space began to shift subtly, turning unnaturally cold, dense, and suffocatingly heavy. The stagnant air inside his small living room developed a persistent, bitter metallic taste, eerily reminiscent of raw copper wire heated over an open flame. His shadow, cast long and distorted against the cracked plaster wall by the singular overhead light bulb, often appeared to linger a fraction of a second behind his actual physical movements, its edges blurring disturbingly into fine, tendril-like smudges of absolute blackness. On the 9th night following his initial discovery, Yusef undertook a significantly more complex, dangerous ritual detailed within the forbidden chapter titled The Great Conjuration of the Lower Circles. The ancient text explicitly demanded a severe sacrifice of personal comfort, fasting completely for 36 grueling hours and burning an intricate, foul-smelling mixture of rare resins while repeating 49 forbidden names of unearthly entities directly into the pitch-black darkness of his kitchen. When the final, heavy syllable left his dry lips at precisely 3 o'clock in the morning, the small flame of his oil burner flared up violently into a brilliant, towering column of violet fire before abruptly dying out without a sound. The small kitchen was instantly plunged into an absolute, suffocating darkness that felt almost solid and heavy, pressing relentlessly against his bare skin like freezing water from a deep well. From the far, forgotten corner of the kitchen, near the disused pantry door, a low, wet-breathing sound slowly emerged, deep, deliberate, and entirely non-human in its rhythmic cadence. It was accompanied by the sudden, overwhelming stench of stagnant river mud, damp decay, and dried livestock blood. Yusef felt his heart hammer wildly against his ribcage, his breath catching painfully in his tight throat as he fumbled blindly and frantically across the rough wooden table searching for his box of matches. Before his trembling fingers could locate the wooden box, a freezing, dry whisper brushed directly against the delicate skin of his right ear, speaking in an archaic, guttural dialect that vibrated straight into his jawbone. The disembodied voice did not openly threaten him. Instead, it calmly offered him a profound trade, an exchange of immeasurable, forbidden knowledge for simple, specific acts of unquestioning obedience. The unseen entity demanded that Yusef leave a small copper bowl filled to the brim with fresh milk and 3 drops of his own blood upon the cold threshold of the local cemetery before the morning call to dawn prayer echoed through the city. Trembling uncontrollably in the pitch-black kitchen, Yusef quietly agreed, finally striking a match to light the candle once more. The claustrophobic room was completely empty, yet the dusty surface of the wooden table was now covered in a fine, uniform layer of dark gray ash, neatly arranged into the perfect shape of an open palm pointing directly toward the distant city cemetery. Yusef looked down at his own pale reflection in the cold windowpane, noticing with a sudden wave of horror that the scara of his left eye had developed a permanent, dark crimson ring surrounding the iris, a terrifying physical mark of the ancient covenant he had unwittingly signed. The dark red ring circling Yusef's left iris expanded rapidly over the following week, becoming a permanent, unnatural crimson stain that caught and reflected the pale, flickering glow of every passing street lamp. His normal sleep vanished entirely, replaced by an unsettling, hyper-aware trance state where long hours dissolved in mere seconds as he obsessively studied the ancient, brittle parchment. The profane manuscript no longer required external lighting. Its archaic text emitted a soft, phosphorescent shimmer that burned mercilessly against his retinas long after he closed his weary eyes. The small, mundane favors he once enjoyed were swiftly replaced by far greater, infinitely more terrifying manifestations of supernatural influence. He could predict with absolute precision the exact moment a complete stranger would collapse on the cobblestone street, or whisper a single guttural word to bend the stubborn will of his arrogant superiors at the municipal archive, causing them to bow their heads submissively and hand over classified regional records without a single question. Yet, the sinister entity that dwelt within the freezing spaces between the written lines grew increasingly insatiable, demanding escalating acts of severe spiritual compliance. The simple, initial offerings of fresh milk and blood were no longer sufficient to appease the unseen, oppressive presence that now permanently occupied his cramped third-floor apartment. On a freezing midnight in early December, the heavy, water-stained pages of Shams al-Ma'arif turned completely on their own with a sharp, sickening sound reminiscent of snapping human bones, stopping abruptly at an obscure section written in thick, tar-like ink entitled The Binding of the Unseen Kings. The dark instructions were terrifyingly explicit, arranged within intricate geometric grids that pulsed with a faint, sickening thermal heat. The text strictly required Yusef to harvest 3 fresh copper coins, submerge them overnight in stagnant rainwater collected directly from a fresh grave, and deeply bury them beneath the cold threshold of his oldest living relative, his aging uncle who operated a small, dusty bookshop near the historic citadel. Driven relentlessly by an irresistible, agonizing compulsion that completely overwhelmed his remaining moral hesitation, Yusef fulfilled the dark ritual under the total cover of a dense, fog-heavy night in Old Cairo. As he drove the very last copper coin into the damp dirt outside his uncle's worn wooden doorway, a sharp, agonizing metallic screech echoed violently through his skull, as though a rusty iron needle were being dragged forcefully across shattered glass. Within 24 hours, his unsuspecting uncle suffered a sudden, catastrophic stroke that left him entirely mute and paralyzed, while his uncle's invaluable collection of rare manuscripts was miraculously transferred in ownership to Yusef through a newly discovered, legally binding codicil. The sickening horror of what he had directly caused fought briefly against the surging, intoxicating rush of supernatural authority that vibrated through his cold veins, making him feel chillingly elevated above the ordinary, frail humans shuffling aimlessly through the crowded streets below. The claustrophobic apartment itself had now fully transformed into a terrifying gateway of cold physical anomalies that defied every established law of nature. The temperature inside his living room constantly hovered near freezing, causing his labored breath to materialize in heavy, pale clouds, even as the stifling summer heat flared outside the thin glass. Heavy, unnatural shadows detached themselves from the dark wooden furniture, pooling ominously beneath the cracked plaster ceiling like thick black oil, moving in slow, deliberate spirals whenever he turned his back. On the 13th night, as Yusef sat silently at the exact center of a newly drawn sigil made of crushed sulfur and dried bay leaves, the dark shadows gathered into a dense, towering mass near his front door. A voice, no longer a faint whisper, but a resonant, multi-layered roar that vibrated violently through the ancient floorboards, demanded an ultimate, irrevocable sacrifice to finalize his ascension into the higher circles of the forbidden grimoire. The multi-layered roar reverberating violently through the small apartment shattered 3 glass panes in the street-facing window, sending razor-sharp shards of clear glass cascading into the dark alleyway below. The horrifying entity within the towering shadow mass grew steadily taller, its formless, abyssal silhouette pressing relentlessly against the sturdy ceiling beams until the cracked plaster gave way and showered pale gray dust over Yusef's trembling, cold shoulders. The terrible demand issued by the ancient presence was stark, totally devoid of any human mercy or room for negotiation. Yusef was explicitly instructed to locate a specific, innocent child from his old neighborhood in El Gamaliya, draw a complex seal of final submission upon the child's forehead using oil mixed with damp grave soil, and recite the 49th verse of the forbidden manuscript completely backward precisely at midnight. In exchange for this horrifying act, the unholy manuscript promised him absolute, unconditional control over the physical realm, rendering him entirely immune to death, crippling disease, and the passage of time itself. For the very first time since discovering the heavy leather-bound volume, a cold, violent wave of genuine horror pierced through Yusef's dizzying delusion of supernatural grandeur. The practical, logical foundation of his former life suddenly reasserted itself with terrifying clarity, exposing the monstrous, inescapable trap he had blindly walked into. He had foolishly believed himself to be an absolute master of ancient sciences, a brilliant scholar unlocking the dark, hidden mechanics of reality, but he was now horrifyingly aware that he was nothing more than a helpless puppet, a disposable tool being used by an ancient, predatory intelligence to permanently anchor its physical presence into the material world. Looking down in shock at his own trembling hands, he saw that his fingernails had turned a pale, bruised purple, and the delicate skin over his knuckles was dry and cracked like aged parchment, visibly showing the severe physical cost of his unnatural bargains. Refusing outright to carry out the abhorrent, unthinkable task, Yusef frantically grabbed the heavy brass clasp of Shams al-Ma'arif, attempting to force the thick volume shut and seal it forever within its iron-bound box. The exact moment his cold fingers made contact with the cracked leather cover, a searing, white-hot heat surged violently into his palms, blistering his skin instantly with intricate, raised sigils that perfectly matched the crimson diagrams on the pages. He cried out in absolute agony, dropping the heavy book onto the wooden table, but the brittle pages began to turn rapidly on their own, generating a localized gale of icy, howling wind that scattered his research notes wildly across the darkened room. The entity in the corner shifted forward, its formless, suffocating mass expanding rapidly to block the only exit from the apartment, filling the cold air with the unbearable stench of rotting vegetation and ancient burial shrouds. Realizing with mounting terror that he could never defeat the physical entity through raw resistance or simple refusal, Yusef desperately feigned total compliance, bowing his head submissively toward the glowing pages and whispering a solemn, fake vow to execute the profane ritual before the next full moon. The crushing, oppressive weight in the room lifted slightly, the dark shadow mass receding back into the freezing recesses of the plaster ceiling, though the icy temperature remained firmly in place. Yusef stood completely alone in his wrecked, dust-covered living room, his blistered, bleeding hands trembling uncontrollably as he stared down at the glowing manuscript. He knew with absolute certainty that the ancient entity would inevitably return at midnight to claim its terrible debt, and that his remaining time was running out rapidly. He desperately needed to find a way to break the dark covenant permanently, even if it meant risking his own fragile soul in a final, desperate confrontation with the ancient force bound to the yellowed pages. The ancient quarter of El Gamaliya lay shrouded under a suffocating blanket of heavy sulfurous fog, a freezing mist that rolled steadily off the Nile and settled deep into the narrow, maze-like alleyways of Old Cairo. Inside his third-floor apartment, Yusef worked with manic, methodical speed, his trembling fingers raw and white from the bitter, unnatural cold that radiated directly out of the manuscript's open pages. He was no longer foolishly trying to appease the entity. He was frantically attempting to construct an unbreachable countersigil outlined in a long-forgotten commentary buried within the dense marginal notes of page 314. The commentary, scribbled in a cramped, Faded Hand by an anonymous 17th century scholar, spoke of the seal of solitary ash, a desperate, extremely dangerous rite designed specifically to sever the spiritual umbilical cord connecting an overly ambitious practitioner to an active, predatory grimoire. To properly execute the seal, Yusef carefully gathered the remaining physical artifacts of his brief, unnatural success. He placed the Ottoman silver coins, the dried parchment notes, and the rusted tin box onto a heavy copper tray positioned precisely at the exact center of his claustrophobic room. Using a charred piece of willow branch dipped in concentrated salt water, he painstakingly inscribed a double concentric circle around his feet, carefully marking the border with 49 distinct, terrifying astrological symbols corresponding directly to the lunar mansions. His severely blistered hands trembled violently as he struck a wooden match, setting fire to his own extensive research journals and watching the dense ink curl and blacken rapidly within the copper tray. The pungent smell of burning paper filled the small room, partially masking the nauseating stench of grave soil, rotting vegetation, and ozone that had persisted since midnight. As the pale flames consumed the paper, creating the essential solitary ash required for the binding ritual, the temperature inside the apartment dropped precipitously toward freezing. Moisture froze instantly upon the cracked glass window panes, forming delicate, razor-sharp patterns of thick frost that completely blocked out the pale light of the street lamps below. From the dark shadows beneath the heavy timber wardrobe, a series of wet, rhythmic thuds vibrated through the floorboards, the unmistakable, horrifying sound of something massive dragging itself across the room without using legs. The shadows pooled together like thick liquid tar, rising steadily toward the plaster ceiling and coalescing into a towering, indistinct mass featuring 3 luminous, milky white apertures where human eyes should have been. The ancient entity had instantly recognized the forbidden rite of severance. The multi-layered roar returned with terrifying force, no longer merely echoing from the thin walls, but rattling violently directly within the bones of Yusef's skull, attempting to shatter his fragile concentration and break the salt-bound protective circle surrounding his feet. "You cannot unwrite the ink once it has entered the vein," the voice hissed venomously, carrying a freezing draft that threatened to scatter the burning embers within the copper tray. Yusef closed his eyes tightly, held his breath against the suffocating, crushing pressure, and reached straight into the hot ashes with his bare, severely blistered right hand. He scooped up a dense handful of the smoldering gray powder, raising his arm to cast the solitary ash directly into the center of the looming shadow mass. The exact moment the smoldering ash touched the dense shadow mass, a deafening crack echoed violently through the cramped apartment, sounding strikingly like the thick structural timber of a massive wooden ship snapping against a jagged reef. The ancient entity shrieked, a terrifying, high-pitched metallic frequency that instantly shattered every ceramic cup resting on the kitchen shelves and sent long, jagged fissures shooting across the cracked plaster walls. The looming shadow recoiled violently toward the ceiling, its milky white eyes flickering frantically and dimming like dying coals as the sacred ash swiftly dissolved its localized physical form. For a fleeting fraction of a second, the suffocating atmosphere inside the room cleared completely, and Yusef felt the agonizing, icy grip on his trembling jawbone relax, finally allowing cold, natural air back into his burning, starved lungs. Without pausing to savor the temporary victory, Yusef dropped heavily to his knees, seizing the thick leather volume of Shams al-Ma'arif directly from the battered wooden table. Following the precise instructions of the ancient counter-sigil, he slammed the heavy brass clasp shut and wrapped the entire unholy manuscript inside a thick, protective sheet of lead foil he had salvaged from old water pipes in the municipal basement. He tightly secured the heavy bundle with coarse hemp rope, carefully dipping the main knot into melted red wax to permanently lock the physical object away from the dark, ethereal currents surrounding it. As the final drop of crimson wax hardened on the rough knot, the apartment fell into a total, suffocating silence. A quiet so absolute and heavy that Yusef could clearly hear the rapid, rhythmic ticking of his own anxious heart beating loudly against his ribs. Exhausted, covered in black soot, and bleeding profusely from his severely blistered palms, Yusef slumped heavily against the damp plaster wall beneath the shattered window, watching the pale gray light of dawn filter slowly through the frosted glass panes. He truly believed the horrifying nightmare was over, convincing himself that the solitary seal had successfully isolated the ancient grimoire's influence and completely severed his dangerous connection to the unseen realm. He allowed his heavy eyelids to close for the very first time in 96 exhausting hours, gradually sinking into a deep, dreamless sleep directly on the freezing wooden floorboards. Outside his window, the early morning call to prayer echoed softly across the ancient rooftops of Cairo, a deeply comforting, familiar sound that firmly anchored his fractured reality once more to the tangible, practical world of stone, dust, and living men. He awoke roughly 3 hours later to the sharp sound of soft, persistent knocking echoing at his front door. Standing up with stiff, aching limbs, Yusef slowly approached the dark entryway, peering through the small glass peephole to carefully verify the unexpected visitor. Standing in the dimly lit hallway was a young courier wearing the standard gray uniform of the municipal archive, holding an official sealed envelope bearing the bold red stamp of the city director. Yusef unbolted the heavy door and accepted the paper, his hands still noticeably stained with dark charcoal and dried red wax. He broke the seal and unfolded the official document, reading the typed lines in the pale morning light. The letter clearly stated that during a routine inspection of the basement vaults that morning, senior archivists had uncovered a second, identical iron-bound crate, and that his mute, dying uncle had just passed away, leaving behind a final handwritten letter specifically instructing Yusef to open the second crate before nightfall. The jarring sound of his own past voice echoing ghostly from the churning pool of black ink struck Yusef with the sudden, violent force of a physical blow. He staggered backward uncontrollably, catching his balance against the ice-cold, moisture-slicked surface of a massive stone pillar. The thick ink inside the bone-framed mirror began to ripple violently, rising steadily above the silver rim of the frame like a heavy, gelatinous fluid that completely defied the laws of gravity. The pale, unnaturally cold blue light illuminated the damp walls of Vault 4, horrifyingly revealing that the ancient stone surfaces were no longer covered in simple groundwater moisture, but in thousands of miniature, freshly carved sigils that matched the exact profane diagrams from Shams el-Ma'arif. The entire subterranean municipal facility had been constructed long ago not merely to store forgotten land deeds, but to serve as a massive, structural containment grid for the ancient, hungry intelligence buried deep beneath the city. Yusef frantically pulled the lead-wrapped bundle containing the first manuscript from his heavy leather satchel, intending to hurl it violently into the silver frame to force a catastrophic structural loop. But as he took a single step forward, the solid stone floor beneath his worn boots seemed to drop away entirely, replaced by an endless, suffocating dark void where time, weight, and physical space collapsed into a singular, vibrating frequency of absolute dread. The ancient walls of the vault dissolved rapidly into an endless hall of shattered, floating mirrors, each crystal panel vividly reflecting a terrifyingly different version of his existence. Fragile moments where he had chosen differently in the past, quiet paths where he had remained a cynical, ordinary archivist, and horrifying futures where his hollowed-out body walked the congested streets of Cairo completely devoid of a soul, operated like a helpless puppet by the formless entity of the unholy book. From the central mirror, the thick black ink expanded rapidly into a towering, grotesque humanoid figure constructed entirely of swirling, luminous crimson calligraphy. The shadow figure raised a heavy hand, pointing a single, ink-stained finger directly at Yusef's trembling chest. Every single favor you took was a binding thread. The multi-layered, resonant voice echoed deafeningly through the infinite mirror hall, vibrating painfully through the metal fillings in his teeth. Every silver coin, every cured pain, every bent will bound a permanent portion of your living shadow directly to the ledger. You foolishly believed you were isolating the text with ash, but you were merely refining the quality of the ink. To break the unholy covenant permanently, the ledger must be paid in total, not with a helpless child's blood, but with the complete, permanent erasure of your name from the memory of the living world. The terrifying choice was presented not merely through spoken words, but through an immediate, agonizing sensation of immense spiritual weight pressing down upon his mind. If Yusef refused the terrible term, the ancient entity would burst violently out of Vault 4, using the thousands of active sigils carved into the municipal foundations to spread its dark influence across Cairo, claiming every human mind connected to the archival records. If he accepted the covenant, his physical existence would be swallowed entirely by the churning black ink, leaving no trace that Yusef had ever walked the crowded streets of El Gamaliya, lived in his quiet third-floor apartment, or touched the yellowed leaves of Cairo. As the freezing, wet tendrils of the ink figure began to wrap tightly around his wrists, permanently binding his blistered skin to the bone frame of the mirror, Yusef looked down in silent horror at his own shadow beneath his boots, watching as the dark silhouette detached itself from his feet and sank permanently into the glowing pool of the abyss. The horrifying halls of shattered mirrors seemed to stretch endlessly into an infinite dark grid, each individual glass panel reflecting a distorted fragment of a life Yusef had once known and cherished. The dark, gelatinous ink hovering at the exact center of Vault 4 surged violently forward, its thick surface rippling with thousands of tiny, handwritten Arabic letters that formed a suffocating vortex tightly around his trembling limbs. The freezing air inside the void was absolute and unforgiving, dropping far below zero until his labored breath froze instantly into fine ice crystals that hung suspended in the stagnant atmosphere. The multi-layered voice resonating through the chamber was no longer merely issuing from the bone frame. It vibrated terrifyingly from deep within Yusef's own lungs, physically forcing him to speak the archaic, guttural syllables of the binding contract in total unison with the ancient intelligence of Shams al-Ma'arif. He understood now with absolute, horrifying clarity that the ancient ink demanded a complete vacuum to reset its centuries-old predatory cycle. Every tragic soul that had ever opened the thick, leather-bound manuscript, every desperate seeker who had traded blood, sanity, or intent for unearthly favors, remained permanently anchored to the dark ledger as an eternal thread of shadow. His desperate attempt to isolate the forbidden text using the seal of solitary ash had not truly failed. It had simply concentrated the entire crushing weight of the grimoire's long history into his singular physical form. To prevent the ink entity from violently breaching the structural containment grid of the municipal archives and consuming the minds of all old Cairo, Yusef had to execute the final, unwritten command of the ancient manuscript, the protocol of total erasure. With his severely blistered right hand firmly bound to the freezing silver mirror frame, Yusef desperately used his left hand to draw the rusted iron crowbar from his leather belt. Instead of foolishly striking the glass or attacking the towering calligraphy entity directly, he brought the heavy, cold metal bar down with all his remaining strength onto the ancient stone foundation beneath the central mirror. He pounded the cracked limestone floor repeatedly, precisely targeting the exact intersection of the 49 carved sigils that anchored the vault's physical containment matrix to the earth below. The deafening sound of iron striking ancient stone echoed through the infinite mirror halls like rolling thunder, sending deep, destructive structural fractures radiating rapidly out across the solid granite slab. The towering calligraphy entity shrieked in absolute fury, a deafening, high-frequency wave of pure sonic energy that instantly tore through Yusef's eardrums and shattered dozens of floating glass reflections wildly around him. The thick black ink began to pull back frantically toward the central silver frame, swirling violently as the physical foundation of Vault 4 began to crumble and collapse into the yawning subterranean void below. Yusef felt his very connection to the material world dissolving instantly. His trembling fingers were rapidly turning translucent, and his precious memories of the crowded streets of El Gamaliya were fading away like thin smoke in a rising winter wind. As the solid stone floor gave way entirely, plunging his body into the dark, silent abyss, he squeezed his eyes tightly shut and silently recited the single, unspoken word of absolute refusal he had kept hidden beneath his tongue ever since the fateful night he first brought the wooden box home. The harrowing fall through the subterranean void felt utterly endless, a terrifying, weightless descent through a stagnant atmosphere constructed entirely of dry parchment dust, freezing decay, and ancient ink fumes. Surrounding Yusef as he fell were millions of fluttering, floating pages from Shams al-Ma'arif, their intricate geometric diagrams, planetary arrays, and red-inked incantations slowly burning into glowing white ash before scattering violently into the surrounding dark. The entity's once deafening, multi-layered roar had weakened to a desperate, rattling whisper that continuously circled his trembling head like a dying, frantic insect. By violently severing the physical structural foundation of Vault 4 beneath the city, Yusef had permanently disrupted the precise planetary alignment required for the ancient grimoire to maintain its physical anchor in Old Cairo, effectively trapping both his own fractured spirit and the predatory intelligence within the oppressive, liminal space between human reality and the written text. In this boundless, pitch-black dark, time completely ceased to function in any linear sequence. Yusef witnessed vivid scenes of his earthly life playing out in agonizing reverse. The searing fire in his third-floor apartment extinguishing itself in a flash of cold smoke, the buried Ottoman copper coins returning smoothly to the damp soil outside his uncle's doorway, and the permanent crimson ring surrounding his left iris rapidly shrinking until his eye miraculously restored its natural, practical brown hue. Yet, this surreal reversal was by no means a comforting return to physical safety. It was the systematic, cold unspooling of his entire human existence. The unholy ledger was methodically deleting every physical mark he had ever left upon the material world, relentlessly stripping away his childhood home, his archived employment records at the municipal basement office, and every single conversation he had ever held with a living soul across the streets of El Gamaliya. Floating suspended at the very center of the dark expanse, Yusef caught sight of the original leather-bound volume of Shams al-Ma'arif, hanging motionless in the cold air just out of reach. Its heavy, discolored brass clasp was hanging completely open, its yellowed, brittle pages turning rapidly in an invisible, howling current. A single blank parchment page at the very end of the manuscript was pulsing with a pale, cold luminescence, waiting patiently for a final human name to seal its dark index forever. The ancient ink entity, now pathetically reduced to a thin, frantic tendril of liquid black shadow, slithered rapidly across the void directly toward the open book, desperate beyond measure to write Yusef's true, full name onto the glowing parchment to finalize his eternal imprisonment within the pages of the ledger. Summoning the absolute last remnant of his remaining human will and fragile sanity, Yusef reached out across the void and firmly grasped the floating manuscript with both of his blistered hands. The ancient paper burned his raw palms with intense, agonizing thermal heat, but he steadfastly refused to let go of his grip. He violently pulled the massive, heavy volume against his bare chest, using his own falling weight to drag the book down into the deepest, darkest recess of the terrifying abyss. As the thin, shivering tendril of black shadow struck the blank page to complete its task, Yusef forcefully slammed the heavy iron-bound leather cover shut, driving his own blood-stained right thumb directly into the soft leather to permanently seal the brass clasp with his own physical mortality. The entire infinite void convulsed violently around them, instantly collapsing inward toward the closed volume with a blinding, deafening flash of violet light that completely consumed everything in its path. The gray, sickly morning light that broke over the ancient district of El Gamaliya held no human warmth, casting long, hollow shadows across the cracked pavement of the narrow alleyways below. Inside the cramped third-floor apartment that had once belonged to Yusef, the cold air remained completely undisturbed, save for the exceptionally slow settling of dark dust particles in the freezing atmosphere. The heavy oak front door stood completely unlocked, resting slightly ajar on stiff, squeaking iron hinges. Inside, the small living room was pristine and immaculate, entirely devoid of any physical sign of violent struggle, black soot, or burning sulfurous resin. The floorboards were swept completely clean. The previously fractured window panes were miraculously whole and clear, and the small wooden dining table sat empty directly beneath the single hanging light bulb. There were no scorched research papers, no heavy brass-bound boxes, and absolutely no traces of the thick salt circles that had once been painstakingly drawn across the room. Down at the municipal archives in the deep basement of the old city administration building, Senior Archivist Tarek walked slowly through the damp, subterranean corridor of Vault 4, carrying his daily morning inventory ledger under his arm. The subterranean air down here was unusually crisp, carrying only the faint, familiar scent of old paper, stagnant moisture, and cold stone dust. As he slowly unlocked the heavy iron gate of the lowest storage room, his bright flashlight swept methodically over the long rows of organized mahogany crates resting upon the cold concrete floor. Every single box was perfectly accounted for, numbered precisely according to the official 1978 municipal survey, remaining completely undisturbed by the passage of time or minor water leaks. Tarek adjusted his thick glasses, scanning the typed roster of archive employees assigned to the basement shift over the past 5 years. His weary fingers moved steadily down the long list of names, stopping abruptly at a blank space where an employee identification number was neatly printed without an accompanying name or signature. Tarek paused in the quiet corridor, frowning deeply at the inexplicable blank entry in the official record. He possessed a famously sharp, methodical memory for every single personnel member working under his direct supervision, yet he felt no faint stir of personal recollection regarding who had actually occupied that dusty desk near the main stairwell for all those years. The wooden desk itself sat completely empty, its worn surface entirely cleared of pens, notebooks, and personal belongings, save for a single brass key resting quietly inside the center drawer. Attached to the old key was a faded paper tag bearing a handwritten archive coordinate: Vault 4, Shelf 314. Shrugging off the mild administrative anomaly as a simple, careless clerical oversight from the previous decade, Tarek locked the iron gate securely behind him and returned to his warm office upstairs to finalize the morning shift report. As the midday sun reached its peak over the rooftops of Cairo, a newly hired assistant archivist sat at the cleared wooden desk near the stairwell, carefully unboxing a fresh consignment of historical municipal documents brought in from an old estate sale near the Citadel. Nestled deep between damp ledger books dating back to the late Ottoman era lay a thick, heavy leather-bound volume completely devoid of any title, gilding, or publisher marks. The cracked cover was bound in dark hide, stained with faint, deep burgundy spots around the heavy brass clasp. The young assistant smiled brightly at the rare discovery, utterly fascinated by the intricate geometric calligraphic diagrams visible along the gilded edges of the yellowed paper. Without a second thought, he flipped open the heavy cover, completely unaware of the soft, dry whisper that instantly escaped from the binding into the quiet, stagnant basement air. The absolute silence inside the municipal basement archives remained completely unbroken as the young assistant turned the ancient, brittle pages of the mysterious leather-bound manuscript. Outside the thick limestone walls, the bustling city of Cairo moved in its relentless, noisy cadence. Heavy buses roared past the main square, street vendors shouted loudly over the deafening din of midday traffic, and thousands of ordinary lives intersected across the crowded, fog-shrouded avenues of El Gamaliya. Yet, deep within the quiet, suffocating basement vault, a subtle, disturbing shift in atmospheric pressure began to rapidly cool the stagnant air. The young assistant adjusted his heavy jacket, his wide eyes fixed obsessively on the dense, faded crimson ink of the opening incantation. He did not notice that his own dark shadow, cast sharply against the cold limestone pillar behind him, had completely stopped reflecting his physical posture, its elongated hands lingering fixedly over an invisible table in total defiance of natural light. In the official municipal registry upstairs, the historical land deeds of Old Cairo remained carefully filed in precise, alphabetical order. Every official red stamp, every precise property line, and every documented tax record from the past 50 years existed in perfect, boring harmony with current municipal law. Yet, if a diligent investigator were to carefully examine the archive deeds for the third-floor apartment in El Gamaliya, the aged paper would reveal a terrifying physical detail. The specific line designated for the property's primary tenant between the years of 2021 and 2026 was not simply left empty. It had been meticulously and furiously overwritten with thousands of microscopic, overlapping Arabic letters drawn in dark metallic ink, forming a solid, raised black bar that completely absorbed light without casting a single reflection. The ancient covenant had finally closed its terrifying circle, fulfilling its administrative design across the centuries. The unholy manuscript had not been truly destroyed by the desperate ritual of solitary ash, nor had its predatory intelligence been permanently trapped in the subterranean abyss beneath the heavy foundation slab. It had simply completed another inevitable cycle of human acquisition, exchanging temporary, intoxicating influence for total, permanent erasure, thoroughly clearing the spiritual ledger to prepare for a fresh, unsuspected hand to turn its yellowed pages. The dark shadow that had once belonged to Yusef was no longer a conscious human mind suffering in the pitch-black void. It had been seamlessly woven into the very physical fibers of the brittle parchment, serving as the fluid, living medium that carried the crimson ink smoothly across the pages for the next tragic seeker to discover. As the heavy clock on the archive wall chimed 3 in the afternoon with a dull metallic ring, the young assistant picked up a polished steel fountain pen from his desk, carefully dipping the sharp nib into a bottle of dark black ink. He felt an unusual, exhilarating sense of unnatural clarity wash over his mind, accompanied by a sudden, dangerous confidence that he could easily master the complex geometric charts resting directly before him on the wooden desk. He slowly brought the pen down onto a blank piece of paper, inscribing his very first tentative seal as the yellowed leaves of Shams al-Ma'arif quietly settled into their new home. High above the subterranean basement vault, the biting winter wind swept across the ancient minarets of Cairo, silently carrying away the very last faint whisper of a forgotten name that no living soul on earth would ever remember again. If this file kept you awake tonight, leave a comment below with your thoughts, or share your own encounter. Until next time, pleasant nightmares.